Imagine a storm so powerful it can literally reshape the landscape in just a couple of days. Well, that's exactly what happened with Storm Claudia when it slammed into the UK. So, we're going to dig into how this superstorm formed, the unbelievable damage it caused, and what it might mean for all of us.
Let's just start with one number to get a sense of the raw power we're talking about: 70 miles per hour. And look, these weren't just some strong winds. These were hurricane force gusts tearing across the country. And that was just the beginning.
All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the storm's arrival and then break down its anatomy. After that, we'll cover the huge impact it had and how authorities responded. And we'll finish up by asking the really big question: is this a sign of what's coming?
So, let's set the scene. What did it actually feel like when Storm Claudia finally made landfall? Let's take a look at the meteorological snapshot of its arrival.
Yeah, this was a way more than just a rainy weekend. The amount of water that fell from the sky was just staggering. In some places, nearly a whole month's worth of rain, we're talking 80% of the entire November average, came down in just 48 hours. I mean, think about that. Where does all that water even go? Well, that brings us to the real kicker, the thing that turned a very bad situation into an absolute disaster. The ground was already completely soaked, just waterlogged from a solid week of rain beforehand. So with the soil saturated, all that new rainwater had absolutely nowhere to go, except straight into the rivers. It was the perfect recipe for catastrophic flooding. Because of these incredibly dangerous conditions, the Met Office issued this, an amber weather warning. And let's be clear, this is not your casual, hey, you might need an umbrella today. No way. This is a serious, high-impact warning. It's basically telling people you need to change your plans and you need to protect yourself and your property. So how in the world did this perfect storm even come together? What was the meteorological recipe that cooked up such a monster? Let's dive in and dissect the anatomy of Storm Claudia. It basically boils down to 3 key steps. First, it all kicked off with a low-pressure system forming over Spain and Portugal. You know, that's the kind of rising moist air that creates clouds and a ton of rain. Then, the jet stream, that super fast river of air high up in the atmosphere, acted like a giant conveyor belt. It just grabbed that weather system and aimed it directly at the UK. And finally, as it traveled, the storm sucked up huge amounts of moisture and energy from the warm Atlantic, supercharging itself along the way. Okay, so that's how it formed, but what did it actually do? Let's get into the widespread impact of the storm, how it affected people, businesses, and of course, the environment. And this table, wow, it really lays out just how far-reaching the consequences were. On the social side, you had schools closing down, thousands of people losing power, and roads completely blocked. Economically, flights were grounded at Manchester Airport, and trains were stopped in their tracks by the floods. And for the environment, all that rain caused landslides in South Wales, while those 70-mile-per-hour winds just destroyed habitats and ripped trees right out of the ground. And if you want to understand what this really meant for people on the ground, just look at this quote about Monmouth. The entire town center was submerged under a meter of floodwater. And why? Because the town's flood defenses? They completely failed. It's a terrifying reminder that the very things we build to protect us sometimes just can't stand up to the sheer force of nature. Which, of course, brings us to a huge question. How do you respond to a crisis like this? What strategies were actually put in place to manage a storm of this size before, during, and after it hit? Well, the response really unfolded in 4 key stages. It all started with constant monitoring by the Met Office, using satellites to track the storm's every move. All that data then fueled the prediction models, leading to those crucial public warnings. Then came protection, with the Environment Agency scrambling to get flood barriers in place. And finally, as the true scale of the threat became clear, the Welsh government went into full-on planning mode, declaring a national emergency. And you know, modern technology played a pretty amazing role in all of this. This number, 48, represents 48 hyper-targeted flood warnings sent by text directly to people's phones. That's critical, life-saving information getting to the people who are most at risk right when they needed it most. So now, let's pull back and look at the biggest question of all. When you see an event this extreme, you just have to ask, was Storm Claudia a total fluke, a one-off freak of nature? Or is it a sign of things to come? And this gets us into a really important debate. There are 2 main schools of thought here. One side says, hey, look at natural factors. We've always had one-off extreme weather events throughout history. They just happen.
The other side points directly to climate change, arguing that warmer oceans are providing more fuel for storms and that warmer air can hold more water, which leads to the insane amount of rainfall we saw with Claudia.
And some of the science on this gets even more specific. There's this idea that these massive atmospheric patterns, like the very jet stream that steered Claudia right into the UK, might actually be shifting. And what could be causing that shift? Well, things like melting ice and warmer oceans, all these global warming impacts that could be fundamentally changing how our weather works. So it all comes down to this one final, crucial question. Was Storm Claudia just a one-off event, a random roll of the dice, or is this a terrifying preview of our new reality in a warming world? That's the question an event like this forces every single one of us to think about.